y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more.
Logs of locust cedar splits, I offer sweat and splinters. Forest elders breathe their last, I'll bring them for your supper.
Hey y'all, it's Kelly coming at you from outside of Durango, Colorado. This episode of the podcast features Wren and Ini from the Mountain Jewel Center for Earth Connection, which is an 18-acre permaculture-centered homestead out in the Ozarks. I've been following Mountain Jewel for a few years now, since before Wren and Ini started tending the land they currently steward. I actually remember when I started following them, they were also fellow travelers, and we would message each other here and there over just like cool places to go. So it's pretty cool to see over the years where their life has taken them. So it also reminds me how long I've kind of lived nomadically and on the road, because all of what they've done on their land project in the Ozarks since then is like a huge amount of work and time that I've also been on my journey. So it kind of reminds me, watching them reminds me of time and how fast it can be, and also how much you can do in a short period of time. So I've been consistently inspired by their work, and they have prolifically shared what they've been up to on Instagram and through blogging over the years. And they've shared information about the plants they've been working with and their process of working with those plants on the land where they are. And they've also shared about the trials and tribulations of homesteading and building infrastructure that feels in harmony with the land. And they also take really beautiful photos. So a lot of their blog posts and Instagram posts are just beautiful photos of their land and of the plants with really great information. So I would highly recommend checking their Instagram out too for that, and I'll have it linked in the show notes. I've been wanting to talk with them for a while on the nature of their work and what their goals are and some of their discoveries and a bunch of other things. And it was one of those situations where I had hoped for an in-person interview at some point, but the nature of our worlds with COVID and the sort of unknown of whether I will be able to travel anytime soon, though I would love to go visit my family in the South at some point somehow, but they would be on the way. I just decided to go ahead and talk to them online and share their work with y'all. And despite, the hopes of seeing their place in person and getting to interview them in person, I'm excited about the conversation that we had, and I'm really excited to share it with y'all. So in this conversation, we talk about Wren and Ini's traveling life before landing in the Ozarks, like I mentioned, and their reasons for landing there over other places. We talk about some of the geology of the Ozarks and how it influences the ecology. We talk about Mountain Jewel's land-based infrastructure, their natural building projects, and more. And we also talk about natural building in a humid place and how this might actually be a better option in some instances. We talk a little bit about fire in the Ozarks and how it's sort of a cultural practice in that area still today, which is really cool to learn about. We talked about some of the perennial native and non-native food crops that Wren and Ini have been working with. And some of them include, because I wrote it down because I'm really interested in researching some of these further. So the Chinese Mountain Yam, Gumi, which is a Elaeagnus plants related to Russian olive and autumn olive and buffalo berry. Indigo Bush, Comfrey, Skirret, which is in the carrot family. Sunroot or Jerusalem artichokes. Figs, apples, mulberries, persimmons, elderberries, Paw Paws. Chestnuts and Ozark Chinkapin, Yaupon Holly, Aronia Berry, and more. If you're interested in any of those plants, you'll certainly hear about them in this episode. We talked a little bit deeper about pawpaws and their flavor, their medicine. We talked a little bit on some selected species of pawpaw, how to propagate them, and a little bit more. We talked about Wren's new landrace seed project focused on squash and more talk on landrace seeds in general. And a bit about how they're integrating wild tending into their permaculture project, which is really cool to hear about in that part of the world. So with that, let's go ahead and get to this really awesome conversation with Wren and Ini of Mountain Jewel Homestead out in the Ozarks. Happy listening, y'all.
Logs of locust cedar splits, I offer sweat and splinters.
All right, well, thanks for being on the podcast and driving down to your phone spot and and taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I've been obviously watching y'all's work online for a long time in various ways, and it's been really cool to see how your homestead in the Ozarks has like evolved and transformed over the years. So I'm excited to talk about your project there and really hear more about what you've been up to. So maybe we could start by you both introducing yourselves a little bit about you, and then a little bit also about how y'all started the land project that you're on right now.
Sure. I'll start. I'm Ini, and I moved to the land for almost 5 years ago now. I was raised in the prairies of Canada, where bison are, next to the Red River. And through a series of adventures and travels, work exchanges, a little bit of schooling here and there, and some meditation practice, I led myself through a journey where I remembered kind of that I am a child who has a great potential to be connected to the earth. So it took me a lot of years to figure out what that meant. And permaculture became a thing in college maybe like 12 years ago. So since then, maybe 12 years ago, I had this idea to create, forest gardens and tend the wild and work with wild foods and domestic foods and bridge those. And I met Wren 7 years ago at an eco-village in British Columbia, where I was kind of an education gardener position. And so since then, we've basically been seeking a place to ground, put down roots, and really establish a bunch of trees in the area. And so since then, we've really honed in on what that means. And I've been really grateful to be able to have a space to ground out, get to know myself better, get to know the land better, and really drop down to a deeper level I just couldn't when I was moving around and traveling.
Yeah, so I'm Wren, and I grew up in Indiana in the suburbs, and always felt that was like kind of stifling to my soul. So as I got older, I started taking like wilderness trips, and I always hated coming back. I was always like, I got so high when I was out in nature, and then it was always a downer having to come back to the cities. And at about that time in my 20s, I met a woman who was like, you should really go to this permaculture course. Like, those are your people. And that worldview just totally like blew my mind. And I realized that was kind of like the halfway house between the wilderness and human settlements, to really like bridge that gap and try to find a way to live in harmony with the land and actively tend it and make it better, actually more productive for ourselves and animals. So my journey with permaculture started, in my mid-20s, and before then I had been working on organic farms and just realized how much work annual agriculture was. And so when Ini and I met, we were like, we had the same dream, and we were like, okay, we have to find a place to ground this and start to manifest the perennial vision.
I've been traveling for a while, and I remember, I feel like I discovered you, Wren, in particular. I was traveling in Nevada or something, and you guys had just been like looking for garnets. It's weird how I remember things like that. So I remember, I think before y'all got your land, you were definitely nomadic, right, for a bit, and then you landed in the Ozarks. How did you decide to be there in particular?
Yeah, so we definitely had like a nomadic period where we kind of lived out of our car and just were really like flying on the wings of spirit, like, meeting different places around this country and kind of getting a feel for the history of this country embedded in different places. And we really fell in love with New Mexico. We were living there for a while, but water was really kind of the determining factor for moving away from there, because we both knew that just water was really important to us. So we tried the Appalachians. It didn't work out. The land was way too expensive. And ultimately, kind of through synchronicity, I met someone at a gem show who was like, my vision in life is to help set up homesteaders in the Ozarks. And I was like, cool. And he's like, come visit our place. So we ended up living with him and looking for land. And with land at like 2,000 an acre, with over 50 inches of rain a year, or, sometimes even more, an abundance of springs, and like a long growing season, we were just kind of like, all right, let's try this in the Ozarks.
Wow, cool. I've just driven through that area, but I haven't ever really stopped to explore. It seems like an interesting zone to be doing a project like this, where you have sort of Appalachia meets the prairie. Can you talk a little bit about like how it is to be there and like what that land is like?
Yeah, I think your observation is really astute, because we were talking earlier about how, I don't know geologically how long ago it was, but the mountain range, which is the Appalachians, also was connected to the Ozark, which is since eroded and become less mountainous and much more hilly. But way, way, way back, they were connected in a way. So there is that like rolling hill topography, not so much in our area, but further north of them becomes more of the prairie. There's some savanna and glades. So it's kind of a unique ecoregion or bioregion that has dry xeric glade tops, mesic waterways. So
lots of karst.
Yeah. And as she mentions, the karst topography influences a lot of the water and some of the landscape and the soil quality. So one thing we noticed since moving here, we've been to a lot of different places where the glaciers retreated and left all their goodies for the soil organisms. And we don't have that blessing. We are kind of dealing with a lot lower fertility, a lot lower biomass, a lot lower organic matter, a lot more rocks, and a really unique diversity of species composition. So when we moved here, we had to I personally had to relearn some of the species and get to know the makeup a little better.
And me too. I mean, even coming from Indiana, it's not that different of like a zone, but we have like cacti and armadillos and like even tarantulas actually. And it is a lot hotter in summer, much more humid, and we get way less snow and cold snaps in winter. So the climate, has really been interesting to get to know, and challenging at times too.
Armadillos? I didn't know that. That's so cool.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that I read old publications from the Missouri Department of Conservation from the 50s, and they don't mention armadillos. Huh. But now they've made their way up from Texas and Arkansas and other areas further south. This is the 9-banded armadillo as opposed to the, I think, 6-banded that's South American. And so they're kind of like considered a nuisance species.
Yeah.
There's no hunting regulations on them, so there's open season.
And we have eaten them, which, everyone freaks out when we tell them that, because don't they carry leprosy? And yes, they do, but we usually wear gloves when we process them and cook them really well. But we had a friend from Uruguay, and he said that the armadillo there was like a delicacy. So we had to try it.
How was it?
Delicious. Kind of like, I hate to say it like this, but it's a lot like pork. Like a whiter meat with lots of fat. And we cook it usually in the half shell down. And we had a 2-year-old in particular who he said, "Mom, I want more turkey." And she says, "No, sweetie, that's armadillo." And he just couldn't get enough of it.
That's awesome. So I haven't actually gotten you to tell us what the name of your land project is, and also you could maybe. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah,
we'll talk about it.
We'll elaborate on that a little. We came to the name Mountain Jewel. I think it comes from a Scandinavian story where there's a mythological creature who's speaking to a squirrel, and she refers to this squirrel as my little mountain jewel. And we were reading this in Stephen Herod Biener's Sacred and Healing Herbal Beers, and we're like, wow, that has a good ring to it.
We just loved the phrase, because there are a lot of crystals down in Arkansas by Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is like 4 hours away from us. But we just really wanted to embody that like layer of like treasure and like really special nature of what we can do here in the hills.
So we are on a bit of a hilltop where we steward about 18 acres, more or less, within the Pine Creek, or more generally Bryant Creek watershed in Ozark County. And that drains into Norfolk Lake and Bull Shoals Lake. Those are impoundments. But within that, we are actually bordering Springfred Creek, and the origination of that watershed is maybe 4 miles as the crow flies in a 6,000 acre conservation area. So that was really important to us, that we have good, clean, live water that we don't actually use in terms of utility. We use it more as recreation. So we have a creek bordering us. We have some other pastures bordering us, but really we are a little mountainous hilltop acreage where we are slowly transitioning what was an old field, maybe cleared 10, 12 years ago, and some forest, a mix of hardwoods and deciduous, with a soil type which is extremely gravelly, silty loam. So that gives a bit of a...
So we have great drainage, and we left the forest, as is. We do take some cedars here and there. It's about 14 acres, and then that cleared area was like a scrubby field. So that's really where we're working and like planting perennials, and we have like 2 high tunnels and probably 1/8 of an acre of annual gardens that we like really intensively grow food. But yeah, the perennial projects are really kind of scattered all over on these other 4 acres. Yeah, so when we moved there, like Ini and I were plant people. We had really like no building skills. So that was a huge learning curve. We actually got a yurt off of Craigslist and set that up in winter. And that was our first abode. And the land had no other structures. Like there was like a old trash pile, but that was really all that was on the land. So we started off building a composting toilet, and we had no power at this point either. We're completely off grid. We have solar now and a well. But in the beginning, we were like getting water from the neighbors, and we were just using like hand saws and charging batteries at the library. It was like the early days were really challenging. So since then, we've definitely gotten better at building, and the buildings kind of come out organically of the landscape. We really want to make sure that they sit on the landscape well and aren't like ostentatious human buildings. So we love to do natural building, and I'd say we've gotten better over the years, for sure.
I certainly have gotten a lot better over the years. So we built some of the needs as they arise. We needed an outdoor living room space to inhabit the garden, so we built a little gazebo, screened-in porch area.
Lots of tiny little buildings.
Yeah. And I consider that kind of like a building school. I just took myself to school and just built 5 or 6 tiny buildings that teach me a lot about bigger projects and how to manage that. And it's been really great to kind of meet some of our needs from the landscape and from local materials.
Are there building codes in that area? I'm curious. That's usually
not for us, and that was a huge draw.
Yeah, that's awesome.
One of our lists of criteria of what our land that we would like to inhabit would be no building codes, access to wild water, close to a green space, public space, mild climate. And so the building codes in the cities but there are no codes, and taxes are
low taxes is another
low.
Really important thing for our list, because we didn't want to have to like struggle to just pay taxes. So that's another awesome thing about the Ozarks.
Cool. Yeah, I was curious about that, because that's a huge thing for some folks wanting to live off grid, or like live more the way they want to live, like taxes and building codes. And sometimes it makes sense in certain situations, in certain places, some of the rules, but a lot of it just doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, and a lot of it focuses on toxic materials, and when you can use your own materials from the land, you can definitely prioritize non-toxic materials. So
exactly.
You guys have been I know we're kind of jumping around, but right now we're talking about some of your buildings, and I'm curious, you have been doing some natural building projects most recently on your lands, and I lived in like a cob house when I was in Appalachia, and it worked there because it was south facing and it was designed to have good airflow. It was on a south facing slope and it was designed to have good airflow. I'm curious, and a lot of people are like, it doesn't work in Appalachia, it's too moldy. And I was like, well, actually my space wasn't really all that moldy, surprisingly. I'm curious, like, how I know that it's like it's something you've been working on, but like how is natural building unfolded there, and like how is it even in the humidity and in that environment? Does it work there as good as it would in New Mexico or something like that?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and I think it addresses kind of the core of a common misconception of natural building, where people get into it and they're like, oh, this technique is awesome, I want to do this. But it's not site specific. It's not regionally appropriate. So in New Mexico, the earth ships are a great example. We were all like, oh, this is great, let's do that. And we realized there's 9 inches of rain in that area, in the high desert, and there are 46 plus in this area. So, and not to mention the summers are humid. So we quickly learned that we needed to adapt our systems and get a better foundation in kind of the technical or specifics side of natural building. So our evolution has gone a little bit from, well, cob is cool, it still is cool, of course. Earth ships are great, bermed buildings, but we found that anyone who had a bermed building in this climate had mold issues. They had to run a dehumidifier, they had to use toxic whatever management strategies.
Kills paint or whatever.
Right, and that just wasn't working for us. So over time, we figured out a couple things, and as you mentioned about your abode in North Carolina, or in the Appalachians, it was the airflow is key, and good design is key. So we've learned a little bit about since then, and our sauna wasn't designed to be a live-in structure, but it is slip straw with clay insulation or clay plaster within on the inside and outside of straw. And that works very well. We have not noticed any mold in that building. It also has a lot of airflow through it. And our house is designed, we're getting back to it in a little bit, but our house is designed to have...
We're building a straw bale house.
Yeah. So it'll be straw bale house. It'll be off the ground, about a foot off the ground. The floor will be insulated, and it's designed to have a convective effect where all the hot moist air will be able to be naturally blown out. So to answer your question, it's very important to spend some time in your area. And unfortunately, we don't have the heritage of what has been done traditionally, because we don't have that access. A lot of people, even though there's abundance of clay here, a lot of people actually don't ever do natural building, like clay and straw. I think you really have to get into like Kansas, Nebraska area to find more of that historically. Here, cedar is one of our greatest allies, being like mold resistant, rot resistant. So we have done quite a bit of building with cedar, which people think is like a trash tree, which just amazes us because, we love cedar so much. I mean, the fragrance is amazing and being rot resistance. But mold has been one of our biggest nemesis, actually, because in the yurt, we came back after traveling one fall and our noses were running. We were like coughing. It was like killing us a little being in there. So we actually went on Discovery Channel's Homestead Rescue, and they built us an octagonal cedar log cabin. So that tiny little cabin is where we live now, but it's in the woods, and every year we still have mold issues. So we have to like boil all of our clothes. And honestly, like, we're so tired of that. We do have a composting toilet that's also slip straw with an earthen plaster. And, sometimes there's a little hint of mold in there, but the walls, the clay never has surface mold or anything. And so I think the earthen plaster functions really well in this climate, even if you're completely off grid and don't have a dehumidifier or AC or something.
So you found that your earthen structure, I mean, I know time will tell, has less mold issues than even the cedar house?
Yeah, and I think for several reasons. The cedar cabin was not designed by us, so there are some choices that I would have made very differently. But significantly in this climate, it's so humid that as we know, mold eats dust. So if there's anywhere that dust grows, mold will grow on that, and mold will actually eat that. So the way they built the cedar is it's very difficult to clean. So there's gets in all the nooks and crannies, versus the smooth earthen plaster can very easily be swept up, and it also regulates the moisture. Unlike cedar, clay will actually absorb and, if closed in, maintain an internal humidity of about, I think, 65%, which is ideal for our breathing conditions.
So it's more the clay breathes, like the earth breathes.
Yes.
Cool.
Exactly. And just like all of us biological beings, we have a respiration and an inspiration, and buildings are that too if we design them that way. We've just kind of gone away from that in the past couple hundred years.
Yeah, so it's been so inspiring to kind of bring natural building back to the Ozarks. Ini and I did a little bit before we moved here. I lived at like Dancing Rabbit for a summer, and Ini was up at that eco-village in Canada, OUR Eco-Village, which practices cob there. But really, we just had to break ourselves in through experimentation and messing up. And I had to learn that, yes, you really do have to screen the rocks, because I started off really stubborn, just like, oh, I'm not going to screen. And, you know, just making the clay, the dirt sing has been such a joy for us to have people come and say, this is only earth, you know, and that's really one of our goals, to like bring people back to that connection and realize that it can be an exquisitely beautiful building that feels really great for the body to be inside. Like, I'm a pretty sensitive person, and when I first stepped foot in a earthen building, like my body relaxed in a way that I don't think I have ever relaxed, like especially under fluorescent lights, but even with like drywall. So that's kind of why I got obsessed with it and just started to really want to do those practices on our homestead, because it feels really good to be around.
I can definitely agree with you on that. When I lived in that little cob house, I feel like I slept the best that I've slept anywhere. And I still think back, like, I wonder when I'll be able to sleep that good again. It's something about that groundedness, you know, of being in that space, for sure.
Yeah.
Right. And isn't it like negative ions?
Yeah.
Clay even releases negative ions, just like a waterfall. So like even biologically, it's like refreshing us.
I don't know a lot about like natural building philosophy and history, although I realize obviously that humans have been living in Earth for so long that there's probably something that in us, that DNA connection or something, that we respond to that in a deep way, you know.
That's so true. It's so much older and wiser and deeper than like the past couple hundred years, where building has devolved, I could say, away from like place-based skills, appropriate, contextual, to standardized industrial toxic things. And I think we all feel that and recognize that, even if we don't understand it.
And don't get us wrong. I mean, we do use concrete for the proper, application. So we're not like cut and dry, like no modern materials, but I just think we're trying to shift that balance toward when we use salvaged or natural materials that are local, we do. You know, that's really like our goal and ethic.
Here we are, standing at this slippery precipice, gazing out with vertigo to the pathless abyss. As we spiral in descent, it's hard to see if we're on track, but one thing is for certain, there is no turning back. So what will you sacrifice? What will you leave behind? What tools do you carry in your spirit, soul, and mind? What hardships have you gone through that prepared you for this strife? What gifts do you offer at the altar of life? We are building a bridge across the unknown. We're all going together, no one's going alone. We're all building a bridge and we each bring a stone. No one's built it before, but the blueprint is in our bones. We've been living in a sick way that won't work anymore. Now that the sickness is inside of us, we can no longer ignore. We've taken and we've dominated all that we could claim, and now we're being colonized by something we can't tame. 'Cause the earth, she is wild, and she wants to slow us down to remember our own wildness that connects us with the ground, where our roots grow down deep and they all are intertwined. In this new world we'll be leaving separation behind. We are building a bridge across the unknown. We're all going together, no one's going alone. We're all building a bridge and we each bring a stone. No one's built it before, but the blueprint is in our bones. The blueprint is in our bones. It's in our It's in our We are the descendants of the ones who have lived through plagues and wars and genocides, floods and famines too. Their wisdom lives on in the ground and in our blood and dreams. Let's call upon the ancient ones to guide us through the scene. May they help us to remember how it feels to be in sync with the rhythms of the earth that we're inseparably linked. There's no going back to normal, at least the normal we've known of. We are crossing to a new world on a bridge we build with love. We are building a bridge across the unknown. We're all going together, no one's going alone. We're all building a bridge, we each bring a stone. No one's built it before, but the blueprint is in our bones. The blueprint is in our bones. It's in our bones. Across the unknown, we're all going together, no one's going. It's in our bones. Across the unknown, we're all going together, no one's going alone.
Can you guys talk a little more about your perennial projects and some of your goals with that? And I'm really curious to hear more specifically some of the plant propagation work you've been doing over the past few years.
Yeah, I'll speak to that for sure. I guess I'll start with the context of the first year was spent a lot of time in assessment and observation, analysis of the landscape.
We didn't really plant anything. I think we planted like 2 apple trees.
Yeah. So we spent a lot of time getting a better sense of what was the composition of this ecoregion, this bioregion. And we've settled on and become more and more obsessed with some of these native species that are might be considered pernicious or weedy, things like persimmon and pawpaw and elderberry and mulberry and black walnut. And they're called alternative crops. I don't like to use that term because, I don't know, it's a little demeaning. But basically, we've honed in on a few things that really work well. And what we've noticed is that when we, let's say, managed the landscape, we ran goats through an area once, we burned it, we cut it, and what came back...
All using hand tools. I think one of the ethics, too, has been like human scale. We really want to have something that's replicable without large machinery.
Yeah. And so when we did that by hand, we noticed there was things like mulberries and persimmons and pawpaws that all showed up on their own. And so we've kind of taken that note, taken that lead, and since have been teaching ourselves, making plenty of mistakes, killing lots of plants, which anyone growing plants should do more of. If you're not killing plants, you should be probably growing more. And I only say that because it's a good feedback loop in what not to do. That's just as important as what to do. So we found that, okay, some of these things work really well. And so in the past couple of years, what we've been focusing on is gathering selected genetic material from basically wild selections of plants. So that will give us a much higher yield or a bigger berry or a tastier berry. In the case of, let's say, Bob Gordon elderberry, It's simply just a selection that Mr. Bob Gordon found in his wild that said, this one's really exceptional.
That perhaps the natives had already found.
Yeah. So we've been doing those with persimmon, elderberry, pawpaw. We're also then grafting wild and seedling stock and starting to develop a bit of a nursery where we will offer some of these select genetics of persimmons and pawpaws and mulberries. And just this year, or just this past year, we started seeding out some select Chinese chestnuts. And those represent a huge untapped resource all over the Midwest, really, this country, this world, but specifically because there's kind of a void left in the Ozarks after the Ozark Chinkapin was basically extirpated. It used to be up to 40% of the forest cover. And so from a biological standpoint, that was a huge, huge resource that was pumping food into the soil, pumping food into the animals' bodies and human bodies. And so while that has its ups and downs of propagation, we've chosen Chinese chestnuts as an incredibly blight-resistant species, and we've been starting to propagate those, which this year is the first year we'll be offering them for sale or trade.
So before we really dig into the chestnut thing, because I do want to talk about that quite a bit, I just want to say, too, for anybody listening, first when we moved here, we were reading, like, edible forest gardens, and, like, books about, like, perennial agriculture. And so we just started off, like, really not knowing what would thrive, and we planted a ton of stuff. And over the last 2 years, really, the all-stars have started to come to the fore. So it's really like they've revealed themselves to us, like the plants that are our greatest allies. We were talking earlier, this year we had a really late frost, and it was going to be the first year that like our almonds and peaches and apricots and Asian pears and apples all got fruit, and that was all wiped out. So at about midsummer, we were kind of doing an inventory of like, okay, this was a hard year, but like late frosts might occur more frequently with climate change. And, we have like severe flood events and also like droughty summers. So what really on a year like this year are the plants that are really outstanding? And, elderberry, Aronia melanocarpa, these two just like shone this year because we're still getting like a ton of antioxidants and phytonutrients from them. And we can eat all the meat and greens we want, but we really have to supplement our diet with those types of things. And, we really try to do that locally if possible. So I think just kind of like focusing on those all-stars and making sure that we have this biodiverse perennial landscape that will feed us even in the bad years, that really stood out to us this year.
Wow, I have so many thoughts and questions about what you just said. My first thought is, so the persimmons and what were the other things that came up after fire or after you did the
mulberry, specifically persimmons and mulberry were the two main weedy.
Yeah, considered weeds here. And so we actually have like dozens and dozens of native persimmons on our land that we are now like grafting onto.
Wow. So you didn't have persimmons and mulberries on the land before that, and they appeared after that disturbance?
Yes and no. We did have some, and then they also appeared after the disturbance.
Huh.
So there's a big stand of persimmons that was on the landscape. And as we started clearing out some of the overstory, there was a few oaks and hickories and definitely quite a bit of cedar. And for clarity, it's Virginia or Juniperus virginiana. Mm-hmm. So it's eastern red cedar. They call it cedar.
Not a true cedar.
And so we cleared some of those out. And yes, there were some mulberries and persimmons and pawpaws. But once we started clearing and bringing fire in a little bit, they definitely showed up in spades.
That's so cool. Yeah, I'm always interested in like, and it's like a bigger philosophical conversation about like what should our land management practices be, and like what were the ways that it was done, and how was that and done in a balanced way, and like what are like with human management of wild landscapes, right? And then how should we do it in modern times, where our ability to do things like fire are a little bit trickier. Maybe there, since it's so much rainier, is a little bit more I don't really know what the culture of it is there, but I know in places like where I've been in the Southwest and the West, it's like needed, but it's so it's yeah, you're really limited on when you can, and there's just in some places there's so many people with their homes clustered together that it's just
Right.
hard to do that. But I'm always like thinking about like what would come up, what would happen, in certain places. That's really cool to hear that those plants
There's
came up.
actually still like a great fire culture here. There's actually like a Missouri Department of Conservation sponsored course, and we took it, and you can rent tools, for if you want to have a prescribed burn, and you can consult local extension agents. So we've actually kind of tapped into that a bit, and in spring and stuff, you'll actually see like a ton of smoke on the horizon. Like the old timers do it still. They burn their prairies, their fields, and we actually live on Luna. That's like a very old family in our area, and we live on old Luna land. And walking through our forest with a good friend who's like a forester, we have some very old trees that were burned around them. So our land, who knows when, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, was managed with fire. And it's really cool to see that people are still doing that. Now, they do it mostly to rejuvenate land for cattle grazing. A lot of people around here aren't really into tree cropping, which we hope to change. But
to be fair, there is a bit of a contingent of quail and other wildlife for hunting purposes. So creating the habitat and appropriate systems through the management. Historically, I think it was every 7 to 11 years the landscape was burned. I'm talking pre-European contact. There's been some dendrochronology or whatever it's called, some research into that, and I think 7 to 11 years cycles was what traditionally this landscape was burned on.
Well, it's really interesting to hear that even like the European descendant peoples that live there have a culture of fire. That's something that you really don't find, I don't think, maybe I don't know, but that you don't really find as much. I mean, I think when I was in Appalachia, I was reading about some of the history of the particular area that I was living in outside of Asheville, where people would sometimes burn tobacco fields after growing, and then that would help the tobacco specifically, but it was really about like a crop rotation thing in that way. But I really don't hear about that much, so that's really cool.
Yeah, the Ozarks kept that alive, so that's neat.
Yeah, and perhaps because that's at the time was like the edge of the frontier, according to like the mindset of people who like right on that side of the Mississippi was like, that's the edge, and maybe there's, I don't know, maybe there was something about like that, where that place is located and the proximity to prairie and things like that, where maybe like that was just like, it was further away from like the civilization of the East Coast or something. Yeah. So you guys have done some fire there, and now you're working with some particular plants that seem like the most resilient and most reliable in that region. And are there any other sort of experiments and plants that you're working with right now that you're hoping maybe you could continue and play with?
Yes, there's plenty. Not all of them have been successful. One in particular, a nitrogen-fixing shrub in the Elaeagnus genus known as Gumi, or Elaeagnus multiflora. That's one species that we absolutely love, and we're just getting to a point where we've tried a bunch of different methods of propagation. I think this year I'm going to get some stool layers. So that's one plant that we currently only have 2 of, but have done really well. And it's a delightfully sweet and slightly astringent red berry that ripens midsummer. And as a nitrogen-fixing shrub, it has a great role and potential. So we are excited to work with that more. We didn't mention one of the species, which is another native. It's a great pollinator habitat and a great nitrogen fixer and a great biomass builder known as Indigo Bush. Amorpha fruticosa is the binomial. There's also known as false wild indigo or river locust, and it is pollinator attractor extraordinaire, and it fixes a bunch of nitrogen, and it grows amazingly.
So along with Comfrey, of course, we, to build up biomass and get some actual topsoil on our hillside there, we chop and drop that and Comfrey and cover crop and stuff to just try to, amend the soil year by year.
One thing I also wanted to mention is I played around with kind of this, I think it's called swidden agriculture, slash and burn. I've done some slashing and charring. I've done some slashing and lying, where I take the growth.
Biocharing.
Yeah, I lie it on contour. Some of the wood I make biochar and then inoculate that with urine and play around with what it looks like to be a disturber on the landscape. And then there's one plant I did want to mention because I can't not. Yaupon Holly, or Ilex vomitoria. It's a relative of yerba mate. And
are you familiar with that one, Kelly?
I am, yeah. It grows on the coast of North Carolina and down south from there.
So we're just on the northern range of that, and we actually got some root cuttings from an area not far away, and we were really excited to start playing with that, and we've since kind of pulled back a little after seeing how slowly it grows, but we have a few plants establishing, and we're excited to see if that could kind of move into the future as a local tea source.
Local caffeine. And another front that we're working on, I mean, we do grow a lot of annual agriculture, but one thing that we're really excited about is finding perennial like root crops. So a couple of them that we grow and we're trying to just like replicate are skirret. It's like a very old plant that was kind of phased out after the potato came on board, because skirret has like really long tendrils. It's in the carrot parsnip family, and it tastes just kind of like a carrot parsnip potato. It's really delicious. But anything that comes back year after year, we are like on board with that. So also like groundnut, Apios americana, we have some cultivated varieties of those. Like one of them even got as big as a fist. And so that kind of thing we're really trying to ally with in the food forests, as well as like sunroot, Jerusalem artichoke. We have some good varieties that, we're trying to select for less crevices, easier to clean kind of stuff. We're just really trying to ground that on the landscape so that in times of scarcity, we always have food in the ground.
Cool. I didn't know that Yaupon grew. You said that's on the very north of its range, probably coming from like the Gulf area.
Yeah, that's definitely like its most popular range. But there's actually, if you look at a map, there's like this little oval of a range that's a remnant range left in Hot Springs National Park in surrounding area in Arkansas. So we actually traveled around on like a plant finding mission a couple of years ago, and we're so excited to find, wild varieties. So that was really cool.
That's so cool. I love hearing about things like that. Like just how ecosystems aren't so clearly defined sometimes, like things don't start and stop in clear lines, and they kind of meld and mesh together. And
exactly.
Yeah. And
right. And then, yeah, that's a great point. And us as humans, we just, are a unique part of the ecosystem in that we can intentionally do that. Unlike animals who might unintentionally eat a seed or carry a seed, we can not only move the genetics around, but then manipulate the environment, whether it's adding biomass or adding rocks for thermal mass and creating heat breaks. There's a huge room there where we look at a USDA map and we're like, that's just a, colonial mindset of here's what this plant does. But if we step outside of that, we realize we can relate to any kind of plant we want. And
really bend those boundaries,
exactly.
through creating microclimates. So we do that with figs in the high tunnel and, trying to do like some season extension. We got really excited about how easy figs are to grow and just how delicious they are.
Cool. Yeah, and you can take cuttings of figs, right, and spread them pretty easily.
They are one of the easiest plants. So I have, maybe 24 layering attempts, and then we'll be taking a whole bunch of hardwood cuttings this dormancy season and stepping up production on those ones as well.
Cool. It's so hard to not want to talk about the invasive plant philosophy and speaking with y'all, because like you were saying earlier how like people feel like, say, persimmons are like, or in the cedars are weedy and pests, but they are technically native plants, which is so interesting. Why the perception of certain plants is such, but then and like, and humans have always carried cuttings or seeds and planted them where they wanted them, you know, and I think about like how it's needed for us to experiment, you know, in that way and bring things from other places. And I know a lot of people feel triggered sometimes about like the idea of like something that could get invasive, you know, or like could get out of control according to what humans think, but I don't know.
But if it's edible, then that's great. Eat it.
That's kind of the line we fall on. Like I grow a plant, Dioscorea batatas or polystacha, and you look it up online and everyone's like, this invasive plant, don't plant that. And like, I respect that view. But for us, like it has edible bulbils, which are like air potatoes, and an underground tuber that's like a yam. It is a yam. And this is called Chinese mountain yam in China, very popular in Asia. And so I'm over here thinking like, you know, this is an incredible plant. It's so vigorous. I'm going to introduce this on my land and encourage its growth and then eat it.
Yeah.
You know, that's kind of where we fall along the lines most of the time.
I think it is kind of a form of plant racism, where we say you're native and you're not native. We draw a line.
Yep.
Ben Falk, a permaculture designer, talks a lot about like, well, when is it native to? Like, what time frame are we talking? Because, well, you think comfrey and stinging nettle and let's see, plantain and dandelion that were brought over by Europeans. The indigenous people have welcomed them and like, great, more medicines. There wasn't, I don't think, the perceived prejudice towards a Western mindset of this plant doesn't belong here, and it was more of this is a friend in the ecosystem. And yes, some friends are pricklier, and some friends you want to keep at arm's length. Might need to cut them back every now and again, or manage them. But I think we're very afraid to participate in ecology, and that's where this land project really lights me up. Is that I can now be an active participation, and I can through using things, through activating, and through needing them. Play a very integral role, even if it's on a small scale as 18 acres is.
Yeah, because we really see ourselves as a part of nature. We're not like divorced humans living on top of nature, trying to keep it in a static thing like a lot of conservation groups do. You know, this is what the ecosystem looked like, you know, when my grandparents were alive, and we're going to make sure that those same species stay here. There's no wiggle room to like co-create with nature and really take a look and ask like, what could benefit human and animal populations as well. And this kind of leads us back to chestnut, which we are like so excited about. You know, I was doing some reading and like this area, the fingerprint of chestnut was all over the area. And if you listen to like old timers talk about how they would walk to school and like pick up just like a whole hat full of Ozark Chinkapin, and that they would definitely go hunt right under the Ozark Chinkapin because that's where the deer and the bear and the turkey and the squirrel were. And the loss, the kind of like hidden loss that is meant for the landscape, you know, it's not like only reforesting the chestnut through Chinese genetics mixed with American and Ozark Chinkapin in order to keep it like it was. It's really because this was like the bread of the forests. And you know, I think there's a huge gap now where that tree once stood.
I have a question about that. So, the Ozark Chinkapin, did that get decimated by the blight the same way the Castanea chestnut did, or?
Yeah, it did. It has. It took a little longer. I think it was I don't want to. I'm not authoritative on it. So,
and also just because of how isolated the Ozarks are, you know, this still is a very rural area, very isolated. So I think it just took a lot longer because, as you were saying, we're a little further from the East Coast.
Yeah, but like the American chestnut, there are still existing remnants of the trees that exhibit blight resistance, and I believe we're at 49 known trees. The Ozark Chinkapin Foundation has documented 49 existing trees that they believe were survivors. And not regrowth from blight-susceptible trees. So that's a very small number, but it does represent a phenotype that is resistant. So, yes, just like the American chestnut, it was incredibly important and was basically wiped out almost entirely.
Wow.
So that's one plant we're excited to work with, and we actually have access to a few varieties of Ozark Chinkapin that are like really resilient survivors that show no signs of blight and like produce a lot of nuts. So we plan on grafting some of those scions onto Chinese rootstock and offering those in our nursery in coming years. So just really allying with these plants, you know, the story, we want to co-create with them.
That's great. It's like, yeah, like working with things that were a big part of the landscape and also experimenting with new things that, you know,
Yeah.
also when and with the climate change that's happening right now too, like assisted migration, like with the Yaupon, or yeah, I'm just moving things around too that like are could be important foods, you know, like you said, when they're when the weather might change more radically.
Yeah, and the chestnuts in general flower very late, so they're very unlikely to be frosted in as late as June. Now, this year was tricky because pawpaws flower over a 3 to 4 week window, and the majority of the flowers got killed this year. It was a freak frost it was even into April.
I've talked to some people who have lived there their entire lives, and they really haven't seen pawpaws get hit this hard very often.
Wow.
So in a year like this, we learn our lesson. But the interesting thing about some of these native species is that they've developed strategies, and seed propagation is not their main form of spread as pawpaws. They normally propagate through root suckers, but they also have a way of leveraging themselves against complete loss by spreading.
Well, like the elderberry is just such a strong one in that regard. But
yeah,
I also want to talk a bit about pawpaw. So that's obviously a plant that we really love and have focused on a lot. But it's so intriguing to us because a lot of the local people will, like, you know, make conversation about pawpaws. So are you going to go looking for pawpaws? You know, the pawpaw is even called like a hillbilly banana or an Ozark banana. And like a large number of locals actually have never tried a pawpaw. So it's really like, yeah, or they're like, pawpaws aren't good for anything but stuff in your pockets. And we're like, oh, sacrilegious. So for us, it's really like the reintroduction locally of these plants that are like, for us, all stars and just shine. And local people, they don't really care about them. And that's where like Instagram and other places, other avenues for us to outreach are really important, because not only do we find like-minded people, we have an opportunity to spread, you know, the information that we're gleaning and our, you know, things we're learning even further.
I think creating culture around these plants is part of it, and some of it is like reviving a culture that was there, and also some of it is like creating a whole new culture of connection, as when it comes to, say, like some of the plants you're bringing in that are experimental or like are great food that thrive there, you know. And I think that's what helps, I think, people feel more encouraged to be a part of the landscape and not see something as a nuisance, you know.
Yeah, 100%. And that's one of the reasons we want to focus on stuff that's weedy, because, you know, we want people to succeed. We want to like see these plants in so many people's yards and fields. And if people are busy, they're not plant people, they work jobs, we really want to ally them with, like, you know, really easy plants. So that's also part of our mission. Like, as we spread these genetics throughout the Ozarks, what is easy, you know, not what you have to baby.
I have a question about pawpaw. Last year I went home to visit my family in Virginia, and I went out on the river with my dad and harvested a ton of pawpaws, and I
remember seeing that.
Yeah, I was really excited about. I grew up there, and no one ever introduced me to pawpaw growing up. You know, I never knew it was on the river. I never even kayaked or canoed on that river growing up. I just went and swam where I could access it from a road. But as you kayak down, you just see so many pawpaws. And I collected a bunch and froze some and like saved the seed. But I ate I kind of like gorged on pawpaws, and then I got really nauseous because
they'll do that. They will do that. It's a moderately common thing. I think it's the acetogens, the Annonaceous acetogens, which are the same components that have potent anti-carcinogenic effects. In high amounts, they do cause nausea, and a small percentage of the population is allergic to pawpaw flesh. There are higher concentrations in the skin as well. So we noticed that when we got really greedy and wanted to get every last scrap of pulp from the first year we harvested, it made the whole pulp bitter. So that those bitter components are partly what causes nausea.
All winter with our oatmeal, we were like, bitter.
someone was saying something about like maybe I was like sucking on the seeds to try to clean them off. That was probably not a good idea too, because that.
Well, to be honest, I do that. I do the seed thing because
okay.
It's really helpful. That's probably the easiest way to clean the seeds is to use the suck method.
Yeah.
But it's the skin I find that, especially on the wild ones,
okay,
there's a much higher ratio of skin and seed to pulp than in some of the selections. So it's more difficult to pulp the wild ones, certainly. Some people wouldn't even call it worth it. I think it always is. But because of that, I would presume more of those acetogens that might cause nausea or digestive upset.
And if you don't get them right at the perfect time, it's kind of not as bad as a persimmon, but I think a lot of people get turned off because they don't eat them at peak ripeness, and you really have to. Otherwise, you're not getting that incredible tropical flavor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the selected ones that y'all have been growing too, mm-hmm. I guess maybe partly are selected for flavor, size, and like don't have as much of that bitter compound in it.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of things that are selected for. KSU is the university that has by far the most invested in pawpaws. They have an orchard. I think they have a germplasm, including, I don't want to say how many, but a lot of some of the cultivars. And they have 3 released varieties that are often larger and rounder. And the rounder the fruit is, typically means that they are there's more space between the seeds, so they're easier to process, and there's more pulp compared to how many seeds there are. So they're easier to ship, they're easier to pulp, and that is, of course, one of the reasons touted as why they haven't become popular, is because to be perfectly ripe, they're very difficult to ship. I mean, we ship kiwis from New Zealand over here. I think we can figure the pawpaw out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, because sometimes they don't look so... They look pretty gnarly when it's the right time to eat them, but they're so good.
Right. And totally. I think that's like kind of on a general term, a lot of this perennializing or eating wild foods or shifting our diets to be more inclusive of things that are weedy and opportunistic means shifting what we think of as edible. We're so conditioned in this fallacy that things should all be perfect and uniform. That's all propped up by a petrochemical toxic-based agriculture system. So with the pawpaw or the persimmon for that matter, it's like
it's
weird.
Gonna look ugly.
Yeah, like somebody said, "Oh, it's like arty chewed texture," and most people wouldn't want a schmoopy arty chewed fruit. But if you close your eyes and get over your prejudice about texture or sight, you might realize that, oh my gosh, this is absolutely treasure.
And the same must be said, for annual agriculture as well. Like, working as a farmer, you learn early that, the markets prize blemish-free and beautiful fruit, but a lot of the fruit's ugly. A lot of the fruit is just a little messed up. And I think we have to shift that culture as well around, eating things that are a little bit damaged, as consumers, really shift that.
Yeah, totally. My parents planted all these old apples on their land in Virginia that they didn't... They're heirloom varieties that are more adapted to the mountains of Virginia, so they have some issues with the cedar rust from the Juniperus virginiana trees, but that are really prolific where my parents' land is. But they hate on their apples because they look very gnarly. But they're for cider pressing too. That's kind of what they were selected for more than eating, but also when you eat them they're good, they're just we'll never be able to sell these.
Yes.
I'm it's okay, I think they're beautiful,
Totally.
Yeah.
So,
we just this year actually, Missouri, it's kind of a not very commonly known fact, but Missouri used to rival California in orchard production. And actually before the Prohibition, Missouri actually had the most vineyards in North America. And then Prohibition made them all tear out of the ground. So we're always on the hunt for, feral apples or different genetics. And a guy in Fayetteville, Arkansas named Guy Ames, if anyone listening is looking for Ozark bioregion orchard genetics, he has definitely done a lot of work for 40 years. We're focusing more on persimmons and, pawpaws and stuff. But we just this year found a really great apple tree, in a little trailer park. And the guy was like, go ahead, I'm not going to eat them. But that's very scarce around here.
Wow, even though there used to be tons of them.
Exactly,
Wow.
yeah.
And I would guess if we go further north, there'd be a lot of pippins or seedling apples based on human and wildlife transmission through feces.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be really interesting to investigate. We just haven't gone there and looked in the wood lines and the wood lots. But Missouri is about 80% privately owned. So it does kind of limit where we can access. People are pretty protective about their private property, and they'll let you know that. So we've yet to explore that avenue.
Yeah, that's tricky. Maybe putting an ad in the newspaper. A lot of older people still read the newspaper and like, hey, we want.
It's so true.
Seeking gnarly pippins. Do you have any?
You never know who might reach out.
Yeah, this is true.
So Wren,
every year our foraging gets better and better because more people know about us, and they're like, you've got to come check out this amazing persimmon. The persimmons are as big as your fist. So every year, like our bioregional map expands, which is awesome. The abundance and the yields get greater every year.
That's so cool. Wren, you were mentioning yesterday we were in conversation online, like you wanted to speak a little bit about some squash propagation projects that you've been up to. I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, so, we started growing squash here, and Ini and I love squash. And every year, the squash bugs would just decimate the crop.
And the vine borers.
And the vine borer, and like bacterial sudden wilt, the death of the plant. And, I had friends, and I'm like, what are you doing with the squash here? And, ultimately, one friend was like, well, I'm just going to give up. And I was like, I can't give up. Like, we love squash so much, and I believe in it as like a staple crop. So this year, I was watching a documentary about a guy named Rob Greenfield. He is on Instagram. He kind of became popular because he tried to grow and forage. He did successfully grow and forage all of his food last year in Florida. And he talked about a plant called the Seminole Pumpkin, a squash that the Seminole Indians grew. I think it's pronounced Chasahuitzka. I might be mispronouncing that, but it means hanging pumpkin because they would grow it in the Everglades and actually trellis it, let it climb on dead standing trees. And he said, this plant's amazing. It withstands all pest pressure. And so that was on my list. And then I started just trying to find varieties that were hardy against squash bugs. And there's actually not a lot of research that's been done on that. And then a guy named Joseph Lofthouse came across my vision, and he's unique because he lives in like a mountainous region of Utah with like a 80-day, I want to say, growing season. And he has successfully bred landrace varieties of squash, okra, corn, tomatoes, and he's doing this through, basically creating modern day land races, which is kind of a loose term for like a seed that carries a lot of different genetic information in it that is bioregionally adapted. And so I started to get like really excited, and I was like, I think I need to create a land race for the Ozarks. So I started putting word out on social media, started talking to local people who I know who grow squash and who are plant geeks like me. And I collected probably 10 different varieties, some of them heirloom, one landrace called Rancho Marquez from Mexico, one is called Ozark Gold. It's like a butternut some friends of ours grow that has been grown here since the 40s. I just started talking to people what works. And so I'm going to start like a massive breeding. I already started it this year, a massive breeding project. And I actually want to try to get a grant through the SARE program, to start the production of this landrace. And so I've got a lot of growers in the Ozarks. I've already reached out to a lot of people in the region who want to trial these seeds for me. And we've got like a cheese, like a Long Island cheese variety that does really well. I got some stuff from a place called Commonwealth Growers down in Virginia, at one of the intentional communities down there. They've done some trialing on the mildew, and also on the vine borer. But again, no one has really done squash bugs. So this year I was able to grow more squash than we've ever grown. So it was really inspiring to already have found that really the key was in genetics. And I think one of the things I picked up from Joseph Lofthouse and Carol Deppy and these other seed breeders is that during climate change, and I really want to impart this to people, as the climate changes, our heirloom seeds are really inbred. So what that is like they cross them back on themselves, to make them pure. So you basically get the same expression, physical characteristics every year. That's what we're used to as a culture. We want our butternut to look like a butternut. So with the landrace, because it contains so much genetic diversity, it might not always look the same. You might get one that's long, one that's orange, one that's yellow. But within that genetic coding contains really smart seeds at that point. So say you get like a drought year, or say the pest pressure is really bad that year. You've got that genetic information in the seed that can express itself. And so it's really almost like more ninja-like. You're going to get the seed that's not really inbred, and it can express and fight and win against the bugs. So that's really my vision with the squash breeding project. So if anyone listening has a great squash that really does well, please contact me. I'm definitely down to trade seeds with other people. And if you're in the Ozarks, part of my outreach is to start spreading these seeds around. And each year I'm just going to select for incredible vigor, resistance against squash bugs, flavor, of course. I don't really care what size they are at this point. But that's kind of the down low for the squash breeding project. And it's machata squash I'm working on.
Are you growing them up in trees too? Like just to see how that is?
I did, yeah. Kind of inadvertently too. We have a Tycoon cob squash from, I think, Baker Creek, and a lot of other places sell it. That did go in a tree. So how many pounds do you think that was, Ini?
That must have been at least 12 pounds.
Yeah, the other night it was dark and I was looking up at the squash. It was like 8 foot high in a persimmon tree. It was bending the persimmon over, and I was like, I had already had one that crashed to the ground, because the vine couldn't hold it. But this vine was so strong. So obviously the Seminole is kind of a smaller pumpkin, maybe like a pound, 2 pound, and it's really round and it has like a tight figure. Whereas the Tycoon cob, if you've ever seen it, is pretty big, kind of warty. So yeah, I'm definitely growing them in trees, and I really like that blend of perennial agriculture, growing it in the food forest with shrubs and stuff, and mixing annual agriculture with that, because we've kind of gone away from just having these straight rows, and we're really trying to have annual crops grow in and amongst our shrubs and our vines and stuff. So I think that's a great way to integrate a crop that was traditionally grown in trees as also a protective mechanism to really inform our homestead in that way.
Just as an added bonus on that note, ducks predated on a lot of our young squash and either killed them or set them back. Oh. So when they're up in the tree, the ducks generally don't fly and hover to peck at the squash. So that does protect them as well.
I remember I went to Kauai, not this year, but the year before, and I volunteered on the volunteer days at the Kauai Food Forest. And they're doing very much tropical propagation. It's a place where you can pretty much take a cutting of most things and just stick it in the earth and it'll work.
Oh,
I mean,
jealous.
That's there is some stuff that needs a lot more attention, but I do remember they were growing hard-skinned squashes up in trees there, like in the same way you're talking about. And they couldn't really grow soft skinned squashes, like zucchini and like summer squash, because the bees or like the hornets would sting them and make them rot. It was crazy. I was like, really? Huh. But also,
oh wow, never heard of that.
Yeah, the hard skinned squashes there too, they had animals like wild pigs and chickens and stuff that could easily mess with them. So yeah, they had them all in the trees and stuff, and I had never seen that gourds and like big things. Yes. And you're like, it works. Like the vine just it just like accommodates for the weight of that fruit,
Yeah, and I think it's kind of happier up there. So we actually trialed gourds this year as well, because a lot of local people said that, if a zucchini gets hit, a lot of these gourd species won't. So we tried like Kikinda or Chichinda. We tried another one called like snake bean. It's really a gourd. It's called a bean. And just trialing different stuff, that could become like a staple crop here that grows in trees. So we did trellis those.
Cool.
So a lot of potential. Yeah.
So just one more thing about landrace and heirloom. I'm still trying to understand what landrace is, and it's really interesting the more I learn. I have some friends down in New Mexico growing like corn that they call landrace and things like that. And so the difference between it and the heirloom is more that it, like, you save the seeds from something that's considered a landrace, right? And then some of the seeds may look like the parent, but not necessarily. Like it has a lot more like phenotypes within it or something, or is it because it's...
Exactly.
it's been grown in a certain area for long enough, but it hasn't necessarily been selected, like you said, like to be called something and it be more certain that it's going to produce the same thing, and yet it's still of that place.
Yeah, I think what we find with landrace is that there's like two keys that allow something to receive that name, and it is regionally based, and then it also contains a wider genetic pool. So when we select for like a breed of something and we want to name it, part of the stabilization of that is through crossing it back on itself, which, you know, in the beginning is fine, especially if you just want something that, you know, you really are looking for. With the landrace, you're not going to necessarily make as acute a selection, and you might still keep that pool, that gene pool, pretty large. And the landrace definition allows for more phenotypic variation. So, like, I was actually Googling landrace the other day, and if you read a lot of stuff like out of Mexico, where indigenous people are still growing, they, you know, if the GMO people haven't started to take over their production down there, really upsetting. But if they still have the freedom to save their own seeds, they're usually a landrace seeds. And so what will happen is, like, a community will save seed. And yeah, something might sneak in, you know, cross or squash are really promiscuous. So you might get like an odd genetic variation in there. And from what I've read, that's really okay. You know, some of the people I'm learning from say that, like, the fruit obviously resembles its parents. So you don't have to, if the parents tasted delicious, you don't have to worry about an odd, wild, bitter gene poking up. That's kind of a misnomer. If you let seeds go, they might start going back that way. But really, if you just cross amazing things, you're going to get amazing offspring that carry the traits of their parents. So that landrace I have out of Mexico, it's actually a native seed search seed, Rancho Marquez. And if you go look at that, there's like a bulbous, huge one. There's a long one. And that kind of variation is fine with me. You know, it's actually doing really well in our land, that squash. So for a while, it won't have a dependable characteristic, and I don't really care about that. And I think part of the education of the consumers who buy squash is saying, we need seeds right now. We need to be courting and making relationships with the seeds right now that are really intelligent, because we actually can't say what climate change is going to look like in any given place. Obviously, we're becoming more like Arkansas here in southern Missouri, and so we really need those smart seeds. So I think landrace is really an ally for us right now. And it's unlike an heirloom. Like, an heirloom could be a landrace, but usually to keep that same genetic or that same phenotype coming up, that's where it's back crossed in on itself and becomes weak and inbred. Just like anything that's inbred, it really weakens as you cross it with itself.
Cool. Thank you for elaborating on that. It's inspiring me to research it more. So cool.
Yeah, me too. I've been kind of crazy about it all year. I hadn't heard of it until this year, and I'm like on fire about it, because I see this as like an answer to a lot of our climate change issues. So I'm like just speaking about it all as much as I can.
So what are y'all feeling for the future of your project there in the Ozarks, and like what are some of your future goals and thoughts and feelings and ideas?
Well, that's a great question. One of the more immediate goals is we got about 3 or so acres in production, and over the next few years that'll mean grafting a lot more cultivated varieties and creating kind of a germplasm bank that we can draw upon, kind of like a library. So we can have a much wider genetic diversity on the landscape we're attending. We're also taking on a management role of about 3,200 acre forest that is currently held in land trust.
Called Alfred Forest.
Yeah, it's called Alfred Forest. It was generously donated a few years back, and they've just signed a carbon contract for 99 years. So part of that, extending beyond the 18 acres that we steward, would be the potential for planting out wildlife shrubs and trees and potentially chinkapins on that landscape. And of course, we're going to get back to our house and get kind of a little more stable setup environment so we can continue the good work we do with food production and preservation. And on a bigger 5-10 year scale, it might see us managing a 5 to 20 acre parcel where we set up silviculture, more of like black walnut, chestnut production where we have long rows of trees on contour and maybe graze animals between. But
we kind of already ran out of space for large nut trees like chestnuts. So we are talking with local people to see if anyone's interested in us doing like a major planting, and if we make some money also just purchasing more land to do that.
Cool. Is it the community in that area, is it still kind of like it seems like in some ways, but like quiet and like, I don't know, do you have a lot of friends and neighbors in that area that you connect with, and like, are you really isolated there, or are there more people moving there to do similar things?
There are more people moving here. It's still, there's still like a local contingent of people, and most people are very kind, very friendly and generous. They keep to themselves. But the more that we're here, the wider our circle gets, which means we're aware of most of us folks who have this kind of slant to our land or approach to landscapes. We're pretty spread out in a lot of ways, but we do see more folks moving in, especially the younger generation.
Yeah, I get more people, especially their Instagram, just more people who are either moving to the Ozarks or looking to move to the Ozarks, who are really inquiring about land use. And, a lot of young people, us included, don't have a lot of capital to buy large plots of land, and usually land is sold in larger increments. So one of the visions that I have is, and if anyone is interested in funding or collaborating on such a project, I'm interested in finding people, is buying a larger parcel of land and like breaking it up into like affordable chunks for younger people, so that buy-in isn't so high. Because I think that land use, that's a huge issue all over the country, but I think in the Ozarks with land at like $2,000 an acre, it's a really reasonable,
or less,
reasonable starting point, especially if you buy a larger chunk of land. So there are, like Ini said, our community keeps expanding and more cool things are popping up, but we would love to see more and more people, especially like-minded people, come here and ground themselves. Like, we're pretty close to Eastwind community, which makes nut butters. It's an income sharing community that is doing excellent over there. It's about half an hour away. So there are young people. We just have to collaborate with them.
Cool. Yeah, it's really hard to find land has water access and isn't totally polluted from some sort of crazy mining or something like that, or whatever, and is affordable. It's the more I've traveled in the United States, the more I realize that's really rare. So
yep,
I know. And like, our water is clear here, and like, I just feel so blessed to have found the Ozarks and to like be able to be around people. There's a lot of people who would protect the water here, local people as well. Like, a lot of people feel very strongly about protecting these waters and the heritage, the land heritage, just really maintaining that connection to the land. Like, most people hunt, so there's a lot of care for the land here. A little more cattle grazing than I'd like to see, but, is what it is.
Or you could say a little more unmanaged cattle grazing.
Sure.
There isn't a lot of rotational grazing. It's a lot of just kind of open range systems.
Slash and burn cattle.
Well, how can people find y'all online? Y'all are very active online, and it's always really interesting to see what you're up to. And what are some ways that you can be found?
Yeah, so you can find both of us through the Instagram account _Mountain Jewel _. We share there a lot, and we have a YouTube channel, Mountain Jewel Homestead, but Instagram is really like the most active platform. And then we have a website, ozarkmountainjewel.com, and we blog. We both love to write, and that's where you can find some of our trees, and Perennial. Our Perennial nursery is also housed on there. And Ini, actually, I'll just show you for a second. He wrote a book a few years ago that was published by this cute little publishing company in Portland, Oregon, all about sprouting. So if anyone doesn't have space to garden and you'd really love to like just have nutrients like on your counter, Ini's book is pretty awesome.
Oh, cool. I'll have to get some links from those things from y'all and put it in the show notes for this episode, because that'd be really cool to check out that book too.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, he's got recipes all throughout time and all over the world, so you didn't know sprouted things could taste so good.
That's awesome. Well, is there anything else y'all want to share before we go?
I think the only thing I would say is that anyone interested in getting involved in the project or starting plants or natural building, I think the best advice I could give anyone would be just start somewhere and just be accepting of the fact that failures are one more step into the road to success. So just try stuff and don't wait to try stuff. Just try stuff. It's never the right time. You're never prepared enough. Yada, yada, yada. A million is excuses. But just if you're feeling it, do it, because the world and Earth needs a lot more people who care, and a lot more people to put their thoughts and feelings into actions. So
yeah, and also just we call our place like a center for Earth connection, thinking about like the larger vision for it, and just inspiring people to really get out and be with nature. You know, we like to hold space for people to have their own experiences, because that's just really where I found so much healing as a human. No, but this has been great, Kelly. Thank you.
Yeah, this has been fun. I could get totally geeky even further about so many of these plants, but I've done that a little bit on the podcast, and I'm like, I repeat, there's some people really interested in this. There's some people like rolling their eyes like, okay, enough on this like geeky plant stuff, but whatever. I love it. Thank y'all so much.
We got to geek out a little. So.
Yeah. Thanks y'all so much for taking the time to chat with me, and it was really awesome. So I look forward to hopefully one day being able to visit.
Yes,
that
we would
be
love to have
really
you visit.
Special. We'd be honored. Thank you so much.
You just listened to a conversation with Wren and Ini of Mountain Jewel Center for Earth Connection out in the Ozarks. And the music for this episode is called Building a Bridge by Samara Jade. Really love this song, and Samara home bases in Western North Carolina. I actually met them in California, or like maybe re-met them because we potentially met in Asheville, but I re-met them in California at the permaculture training that I did with Teo, who was on the last episode. Samara was traveling through and just ended up there and played a show one night, basically at dinner. It was awesome. And then we realized we had mutual friends in Asheville. Their music's really cool. So if you want to check out their music, you can find it linked in the show notes of this episode. And also you can find links to Mountain Jewel's projects in the show notes as well. As always, I link as much as I can from the guests in the show notes just to keep y'all connected to what they're doing and how to reach them. With that, thanks for listening, y'all, and until next time. This episode of the Ground Shots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.